This is a relay project.
Seriously?
Seriously starts now. Here's Supriya and Ryan.
Hey, it's Wednesday, September 7th, and you're listening to Seriously with Supriya and Ryan. I am Supriya Devetti in Toronto.
I'm Ryan Jesperson in Edmonton. Good morning, my friend.
Good morning. You know, coming off a long weekend, it's the official start to fall into summer. Usually you and I would be making, a little bit of chit chat over that, but it just seems a little bit out of place given, just how heavy I think the country has felt over the last few days with the news out of Saskatchewan.
Yeah, this is kind of, I suppose, a unique position to be in, you and I, doing a weekly show as well, where we gather our thoughts about a story, or as we say, we'll cut through the noise of a story. This is an ongoing and developing one that the nation's keeping an eye on. At the time we're talking, the manhunt continues for one of the accused in this stabbing spree, Supriya, that's claimed the lives of at least 10 innocent victims, at least 18 more injured, and of course an entire nation absolutely shocked at what went down at the James Smith Cree Nation in nearby Weldon, Saskatchewan as well.
Yeah, so to your point, as of the recording of this podcast, Miles Sanderson is still at large. He is expected to be injured and maybe looking for medical attention. He's got a long criminal record, several, prior assault convictions. And this has been one issue I think that's been coming up quite a bit, which is, if he's got a criminal record that dates back, 2 decades, he's got a bunch of convictions, 59 convictions that include, property crimes as well as crimes against other people like assaults. Why was this guy out?
Yeah, I mean, on the record, the suspect not considered a risk by the parole board. So shows a report, a decision dated back on February 1st that found that he would, quote, not present an undue risk. The report concluded that freeing him would, quote, contribute to the protection of society by facilitating his reintegration. So 7 months after that report is compiled, this man is charged at large at the time we're speaking, but charged in the deaths of multiple people in one of the worst mass crime sprees in Canadian history. It's got a lot of people talking as well about some of the epidemics and some of the very serious issues that are very present and prevalent on reserves across the country. And that's due to comments that have been made by community members at the James Smith Cree Nation that have been talking to reporters that, quite frankly, Supriya, have drawn one of the worst assignments in all of news coverage.
Yeah, no kidding. To your point, this does open up a pretty meaningful and substantive conversation that we should be having about, mental health addictions and supports, as well as like the larger conversation about, the criminal justice system and how we can, in fact, better reintegrate people into society. And, to your point about this being one of the worst crimes and mass killing sprees in Canadian history, I think the international outpouring of support really, showed that. There was a ton of world leaders expressing solidarity and expressing their sympathies, and you don't really see that all that too often here.
Yeah, why is it? Do you think that? I mean, the royal family and presidents and prime ministers and chancellors, like you said, heads of state, have shared their thoughts and prayers, so to speak, with Canadians and Indigenous people in Canada. Why do you think it's this one that's resonated?
I think it's the sheer scale and, quite frankly, likely the brutality of the crime itself. A stabbing spree going for that long, the fact that, they're still at large, or this man is still at large. I think all of that probably plays in. And, I think we do tend to have, rightly or wrongly, a bit of a reputation on the international stage as like Canada being like meek and, mild mannered, that we're essentially toast. Like nobody has strong opinions about us one way or another.
My phone lit up, as did millions of others, I'm sure, as that emergency alert system kicked in. And I think it probably goes without saying, we've just finished this mass casualty commission, or at least Canadians have been paying close attention to that, the review, the public inquiry, so to speak, following, of course, that tragic mass shooting in Nova Scotia back in April of 2020. Do you think it's fair to suggest that when the dust has settled on this, when the arrest has been made, or when the accused has been tracked down by police, once the funerals have occurred, I hate to put it that way, and once some time has passed and law enforcement starts to look back on this, political officials will no doubt have their own reasons to want to take a look at this as well, and the public will have some expectations that a conversation happens, perhaps an inquiry. Do you think that we'll stack this up potentially against the tragedy in Nova Scotia as an opportunity to examine how the RCMP and other police forces worked together, or how the public was notified?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if we don't, it would be a kind of a missed opportunity. And I would say that already it seems as though there were some lessons learned, at least in terms of how the emergency alert system was rolled out this time around and compared to what happened in Nova Scotia, right? So yeah, I mean, we've got to look into how we better inform the public in, these developing situations. We have an emergency alert system. It goes directly to our phones. We should be using that in these situations.
Before Miles Sanderson's brother, Damien, was discovered deceased on the James Smith Cree Nation, police had reason to believe that the two accused were in Regina. And this was right around the time that thousands and thousands of people were preparing to attend the Labor Day Classic, the Saskatchewan Roughriders, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I saw some people seem to be, sharing their thoughts online, shocked that the game was continuing. Other people not shocked at all. Several, of course, police officials, including Regina Police Service, indicating that there would be extra security precautions at that football game. While it was assumed that those two were at large in Regina, were you surprised that
Yes.
the game continued?
Yeah, I can't believe the game continued, actually. Like, I understand it's like, to your point, it happens every year. It's a big thing. But if nothing else, out of respect for the victims and the tragedy that had just occurred, even if it wasn't necessarily a pressing security risk at that game itself, I think that's what you do when, one of the worst mass killing sprees has occurred in the country.
Yeah. Lots to be learned from this, but as we said earlier, this is still what they might call a developing or a dynamic story, and one that we and millions of others are obviously keeping an eye on. One of the top stories across the country continues to be our growing healthcare crisis, and this opens up an interesting question. What do you do when the system is woefully understaffed, Supriya, and you desperately need to hire people?
Yeah, and that situation isn't exactly as far off as we may think. And we've had situations where it can lead you to a rush of hiring and you're not verifying the credentials as well as you should. And we get into a situation like we did in British Columbia in 2021, where you have a nurse that is working with forged credentials. And when you're understaffed, you're up against the crunch, verifying those credentials and providing that best in-class training is actually even more important. And if you need help with training in a regulated industry, you need to know about We Know Training. We Know Training is not just a standard LMS platform. They specialize in high-stakes training for associations, regulators, governments, and credentialing bodies with the highest degree of quality and trust. To give you just a few examples, they work with credentialing partners like hunter educators and licensing organizations, medical associations, training for licensed professionals like real estate, insurance, and the financial planning industry, and many more highly regulated industry where high quality training really matters.
Since 2005, We Know Training has helped hundreds of North American associations and organizations deliver the highest quality learning and training testing solutions. Their platform, their learner verification technology makes sure you're credentialing the right people with a high degree of trust. If you want a training partner who will provide high-stakes training without the hassle, give We Know Training a call. You can learn more on their website at weknowtraining.ca.
The Lead.
All right, so at the risk of pissing off the entirety of the internet.
Ooh.
The summer is over, right? And fall is upon us.
I was hoping
right?
for something much more controversial.
No. I mean, this is somewhat controversial. People do get pissed when you say that summer's over as of Labor Day. But it is, So, aside from pumpkin spice lattes and cozy sweaters and whatever else is going on, we've got a packed political session when the House resumes on September 19th. And this week also, the Liberals are holding their cabinet retreat, right? And it's been reported that much of their focus, as well as what they're going to be discussing and trying to come up with, is going to be economic issues, affordability issues. That's what they're really going to hone in on. And the Conservatives are going to be announcing, who won their leadership race this weekend on September 10th.
That's been such an exciting horse race, hey? Just back and forth.
Neck and neck.
Just
Who's
neck
taking
and neck.
the lead?
Lead changes. Who's it going to be? Everybody's wondering.
Yeah. Well, to your point about the horse race, if you're looking at some of the federal numbers here, and we've got recent polling from Abacus data, I mean, the Conservatives and the Liberals are basically, neck and neck as they head back into the political session. And, I hate polls this far out from an election. I don't think they necessarily give us a whole lot of insight, but it is worth noting that we're essentially going into the next political session of it being a tie game, right?
Yeah,
and so
anybody listening on the podcast, basically this is Abacus data numbers, and it shows the Conservatives, what was it, at 33% here support, the Liberals at 32% support. That both drops them down 1 percentage point from the last election. We'll call it a wash. And the NDP polling about 12 points back at 19%. Are you surprised by that?
No, I mean, they're always hovering around that sort of number. And
I think it's pretty decent for them.
It is. Yeah. And that's not a knock on them.
No.
And I think, Jagmeet Singh, for his part, is generally one of the leaders that has has better approval ratings or has better net positive ratings, but can't really seem to translate that into wider party support for some reason.
Yeah, there's not been a lot of distance. If you think back, and obviously we don't have all the numbers in front of us, but if you were to look at polling month to month or quarter to quarter over the last 5 or 6 years, you wouldn't see a ton of distance between the Liberals and the Conservatives, right? Like, what's been the max? Like 6 or 7 points max?
Yeah, and if at that, right? I agree. It has been tight, and this does raise the question. And to your what I assume was a sarcastic comment about the Conservative leadership race being an exciting horse race. Once Pierre Poilievre is announced the winner, and I don't make me eat my words,
but
please.
What if he's not?
Okay,
no,
what if
he is? He's the leader. He's the heir apparent.
Yeah. So I don't know, how do the Liberals go into a fall session knowing that, he's going to be the leader? They have, for the most part, kind of held their fire on him, right? They haven't really done a lot of negative attack ads. There hasn't been a lot of engagement with the videos or the tweets or whatever else he's putting out there. So how important do you think it is for the Liberals to come out of the gate swinging and define Pierre Poilievre and this, Conservative Party under him before they get to do it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a whole new animal. It feels like if there's one thing I'll consistently bring to this show, Supriya, it's sports metaphors, and in particular hockey. And let's say a team defeats another team in a hard-fought 7-game series, but then that team that lost to the eventual champions completely retools. New head coach, new starting center, maybe a new goaltender, something like that. The champions, if they want to defend, will have to come to a better understanding of what their opponent looks like now. And I feel like the Conservatives will completely reinvent themselves with Pierre Poilievre as a leader. This isn't something like moving from Andrew Scheer to Aaron O'Toole, where I don't see a ton of discernible difference. Pierre Poilievre's entire MO, his entire approach to politics, and quite frankly, his ability to thrust and parry in the House, and he will have an absolute heyday during question period. And I think the Liberals better get ready, because I think that they're going to have their hands full with the style that Pierre Poilievre brings to the table. I think he could make him look stupid in a hurry from a soundbite perspective. I'm not talking about substance. I'm talking about sound bites.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I would add to that by just saying that I think the Liberals have to get a lot smarter about the way that they respond to Pierre Poilievre, and either not getting goaded into responding to every single attack that there is, and explaining, in plain language, a lot more clearly and a lot more transparently about why they take issue with some of the things that the Conservative Party or Pierre Poilievre is going to be putting out there. And I think a very good example of this is if you're talking about affordability. Okay, let's just use that as an example. This is what the Liberals are focusing on in terms of their cabinet retreat. It's top of mind for most voters. I think you pin, Pierre Poilievre into a corner. It's like, okay, well, once we deliver on dental care, which we know the Liberals are going to have to if they want this NDP deal to stick, right? As well as like pharmacare and their current deal with the provinces on childcare. What would a Conservative Party do with that? Are they going to roll all that back? Like, it's really hard to take something away from people once they already have it, right? If you're talking about the next pandemic, right? This iteration of the Conservative Party is basically all in on freedom convoy stuff. They're anti mandates, whether that's masks or vaccines. How does a Conservative government handle the next pandemic with Pierre Poilievre at the helm? Like, this is a legit question that I think the Liberals can sort of work on in terms of shaping how the public sort of perceives Pierre and the Conservatives going forward.
Yeah, to state what might be obvious as well, I'll be really curious to see what happens to that Conservative front bench, or to some of the more notable names within the Conservative Party who might not entirely align with the direction that Pierre Poilievre's taking this party in, right? And so I wonder whether we'll see some, I'm not going to say mutiny. I don't think it's to that point at all. And we've seen a lot of those MPs right now come out and support Pierre Poilievre because, of course, they want to hitch their wagon to the winning horse. But at the same time, folks that have been relatively outspoken, even some that have taken a prominent role outside his campaign. I'm thinking of, off the top of my head, Michelle Rempel-Garner. You wonder what MPs like that might do under a Pierre Poilievre leadership. We'll see. There's still some runway between now or September 10th, when that leader's announced, and the next federal election. Lots of time for Canadians to get a sense of what Pierre Poilievre brings from the position of leader. They've never seen him in that position before. They've seen him as a foot soldier. They've seen him as a very effective opposition critic, but never before as a leader. And I'm curious to see not what it does just across the aisle, but also within the Conservative Party.
It's interesting that you mentioned Michelle Rempel-Garner because she's definitely an interesting figure. And to your point, she did have a role in another campaign and has been very outspoken about things that the Conservatives have gotten wrong in the past, right? Like the barbaric cultural practices tip line, and going hard on the niqab ban in the 2015 election, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm actually a little bit more interested in, what happens to somebody like Leslyn Lewis. So if you have somebody who's out there, saying the quiet part loud, essentially, like all the time, as a leader, what do you do in terms of like your caucus discipline? And do you actually discipline somebody like Leslyn Lewis, or do you put her, really front and center and get her rallying parts of the, demo that they think that they need, like that PPC vote?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were to take the Pierre Poilievre supporters and the Leslyn Lewis supporters, and then if you pulled one of those two candidates out of this race, I bet you a majority of those camps would vote for the other candidate. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, if Pierre Poilievre wasn't here, I think a lot of his supporters would vote for Dr. Lewis. And if she wasn't in the race, I bet you a ton of her supporters would vote for either Roman Baber or Pierre Poilievre. So I would think, my gut tells me that, considering who Mr. Poilievre courted to win this race, that's not yet done, but for all intents and purposes it is, I would suspect he better be careful about alienating figures like Dr. Leslyn Lewis, who represent that social conservative element of the party. I think it'll be a completely different scenario under a Jean Charest leadership, to state the obvious. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much what I think. And if you're talking about alienating like demographics of people, to you were pointing out, like the Leslyn Lewis voters, Robin Baber voters, whatever, that's all true, right? But I'm more curious about like alienating the suburban park mom vote, right? Or like the suburban, uncle and auntie vote, in terms of how the party ends up trying to form government. You can rally as many PPC types as you want, but if they don't exist in large enough numbers in the ridings that the Conservatives need, it doesn't necessarily get you anywhere further than you already are. You're just kind of like treading water. And I think a part of this that a lot of, the political talking heads in this country don't tend to understand because of, their own demographic blind spots is that if you are a person, you're racialized, you're a person of color, and you think some of the rhetoric is putting your safety and security at risk, right? It doesn't matter what the party is going to do for the economy. If you're worried about walking into a mosque or a gurdwara or a mandir and, they need extra security, and you're worried about sending your kid that wears like a parka or hijab to school because they're going to get, bullied, or they're going to, so like all of this, I think is worth thinking about. And I'm not saying that that's what the Conservatives are necessarily going to do, but I think it's something worth thinking about, as they crown a new leader.
Safe to say that the amount of time between now and the next federal election might not just help the governing party. It might help the official opposition as well. It might help the Conservatives. It gives them enough time, Pierre Poilievre and his strategists, to swing back to relatively normal. You know what I'm saying? With a little more time, COVID becomes less of an issue. With a little more time, Canadians forget how angry they were about the Ottawa occupation, how disgusted some of them were with the politicians that were cozying up. With a little more time,
which,
Pierre
by the way, is
Poilievre,
like the majority of Canadians, eh? It's
Oh,
like
of
70% of Canadians.
Of course, but this is always the case in leadership races or general elections. Is the majority of people aren't always the people that show up to the polls. Sometimes it's the fringes, or the most angry, or the most passionate, or the most partisan. And to win elections, to state the obvious, the parties are going to have to get out the vote of just the average, ordinary person, and it'll be interesting to see who can captivate that vote most quickly.
Also, there's this.
Too much of what's happening in our country today is not normal. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic. Not every Republican, not even the majority of Republicans, are MAGA Republicans. Not every Republican embraces their extreme ideology. I know, because I've been able to work with these mainstream Republicans. But there's no question that the Republican Party today is dominated, driven, and intimidated by Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And they're working right now, as I speak, in state after state, to give power to decide elections in America to partisans and cronies, empowering election deniers to undermine democracy itself.
So that was President of the United States, Joe Biden, coming out last week in a speech as pro-democracy. And this was somehow positioned as being a partisan thing. Look, I think the optics of him delivering that speech with the Marines in the backdrop, right, like, is suboptimal for all sorts of reasons. You don't necessarily want to politicize the, armed forces, whatever level of the armed forces that may be. But I don't know, like, that ship has sailed somewhat, right, with Trump. And I just think
do you think that he did? Do you think that politicizes the military?
No, I don't.
Having them there
actually,
as
no.
set dressing, I don't think so.
I don't, but I know that it's not necessarily super common to do prior to Trump. So I will defer to American experts on that point.
I just feel like it's more of an American thing than anywhere else. It's like an American, Russian, and Chinese thing. To deliver speeches on aircraft carriers, to deliver speeches with tanks in the background. Just, I guess, maybe kind of a reminder that the United States can kick your ass. You know what I mean? But I guess maybe I felt like they were black. For people listening on the podcast, the guard, the military guard in the back, their faces are shadowed over. It's very dramatic lighting. It feels a little bit less politicized. Some of the commentary I saw, and it was almost felt like, Joe Biden was sitting in between two, soldiers, two Navy SEALs, in their camel with their faces painted, something like that, or I don't know, soldiers wearing elephants on their T-shirts. And just, I don't know. Or maybe I got the parties wrong on that one, didn't I? Yeah, donkeys was what I was looking for.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think donkey.
Oh, shit. I blew it.
I actually don't know either.
I don't know either.
Well, whatever. It works out.
Don't worry, we'll cut this part out of the podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Look, all this to say, I think if we're talking about this in the context of like being pro-democracy, it's obvious that being pro-democracy isn't a partisan stance, right? And I think it's important that in those remarks, Biden sort of went out of his way to delineate and differentiate between MAGA Republicans, who we refer to as being semi-fascist, and regular mainstream Republicans. And I don't know if that works in terms of being able to reach out to those so-called regular Republicans for the midterms that are coming up. But it is worth noting that he did make that difference. And I think in the Canadian context, we should be grateful for all sorts of reasons, insofar as we don't have the same level of the destruction of our norms, right? We also have much better, in my opinion, protection of things like elections. Like, we don't have partisans that are presiding over the integrity of our elections, right? It's like an independent body. When we're redistricting votes and ridings and things like that, it's not a partisan body that is doing that. It's all done independently. So in
You're
that
saying
respect,
not as much gerrymandering in Canada?
No, there's not as much gerrymandering in Canada. Is that going to get me in trouble?
I'm just thinking. No, I don't know. I just think that everybody knows their own neck of the woods the best. And I just remember the last municipal elections that we had in the province of Alberta, several big cities, including Calgary and Edmonton, voting in new city councils, ultimately voting in new mayors. And there was someone behind the controls of the Elections Alberta Twitter account that was getting pretty snarky and undeniably partisan. And Elections Alberta had to switch into damage control mode as people were at the polls, and it was a total disaster. I'm not comparing it to the United States and certainly not comparing it to some of the voter suppression that we see. By the way, Supriya, thankfully, we've got the World Wide Web here at our studios. I can let you know it's the donkey for Democrats. It's the elephant for Republicans, though on this one, I think I come across as the biggest donkey of all.
No, never.
Can you believe that people have to actually come out and implicitly state that they are pro-democracy these days? That used to be a given. It was a joke. It was a throwaway. You'd say, well, this is a democracy after all. Now it's almost like people need to remind their fellow citizens that it is.
Yeah, well, look, if we want to talk about the Canadian context, we do have to do some of that reminding, don't we? I mean, look, conservatives here didn't actively collude with people that were trying to subvert democracy. They were just actively cheering on the people who did it and brought them coffee, right? But we do still need to be pro-democracy here. And I think more than that, we have to watch out about how some of these things, whether we're talking about democracy or whether we're talking about, preserving the integrity of our own domestic affairs and elections from foreign interference or disinformation, we can't let that become a partisan thing. And I do worry about that happening, particularly as we, move forward on this debate about how we go about regulating online harms in this country.
Yeah, no kidding, Canada. So consider this your heads up.
Seriously?
All right, Supriya, so we shine the spotlight on a story that makes us say seriously every week, and this is not, despite what people may think, several episodes in, not intended to be a perpetual highlight of Alberta politics, but yet here we are again.
So yeah, Ryan, I mean, to your point, we don't mean this to be a Dunk on Alberta segment, but look, this is what Brian Jean just came up with this week. Under Brian Jean-led government, there will be no mandatory vaccines. He's talking about changing the Public Health Act, to explicitly say that they're not going to be subject to mandatory vaccinations. And it's like, okay, it's pretty bold to come out as pro-preventable disease in this day and age, but why not? Go for it.
Yeah, so we could welcome back polio and measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria. In all seriousness, though, you have to wonder what percentage of the general population would love to see policy like this implemented, Supriya? 3%? 4%? Maybe 5%? What kind of message does this send to the rest of the country?
You tell me. I don't know. Because I think the vast majority of the country is in the majority of being pro-vaccine, but I don't know. What is it like in Alberta?
I don't know. It's a race to the bottom in that leadership race. We'll find out soon who Alberta's next premier will be, and we'll have plenty to say about that. Hey, in the meantime, thanks for checking out this week's episode of Seriously. We appreciate everybody that subscribes wherever you can get your podcast. You can subscribe on YouTube too, and make sure you tell your friends.
Yeah, follow us on Instagram at SeriouslyPod. Follow us on Twitter at Supriya and Ryan. Check out the website, seriouslypod.com. And as always, send us emails, love or hate, talk at seriouslypod.com.
We'll see you next Wednesday.
Seriously is hosted by Supriya and Ryan Jesperson. Technical producer, John Hicks. Executive producer, Josh Dunford. Account coordinator, Lawrence Norlego. General manager, Katie Cook-Shivers. Human resources, Lena Shepard. Voiceover by me, Tangi. Seriously is a relay project. For more, check out seriouslypod.com.